In the early years of the Second World War, the United States Army faced an uncomfortable truth. It was not ready for modern armored warfare. Reports coming in from Europe painted a clear and troubling picture. German forces, using fast-moving formations of tanks, infantry, and aircraft, were overwhelming entire nations in a matter of weeks. Poland fell in 1939. France, one of the most powerful armies in the world, collapsed in just 6 weeks in 1940. At the heart of these victories was a new way of fighting, one that relied on speed, coordination, and shock. The Germans called it blitzkrieg, and the Americans were watching closely. U.S. military planners realized that their own armored doctrine was outdated. Tanks were seen primarily as infantry support vehicles, slow and methodical, designed to move alongside foot soldiers. But the battlefield had changed. Tanks were no longer just supporting actors, they were the main force. And the German army was proving that mobility could be more decisive than raw firepower or thick armor. As American observers studied German tactics, they noticed something else. The most dangerous threat to tanks was not always another tank. It was a well-coordinated defensive response. Anti-tank guns, ambushes, and fast-moving counterattacks could stop even the most powerful armored advance. This realization sparked a radical idea within the U.S. Army. Instead of building heavier and more heavily armored tanks to fight enemy tanks directly, why not create a specialized force designed to hunt and destroy them? This idea would evolve into the tank destroyer doctrine, and one of its most influential advocates was Andrew Bruce. Bruce believed that enemy armored breakthroughs should not be met head-on with static defenses. Instead, they should be countered with highly mobile units that could rapidly respond, outmaneuver, and strike at vulnerable points. Speed, he argued, was the key to survival and success. Under this doctrine, tank destroyers would not behave like traditional tanks. They would not hold ground or advance slowly under heavy fire. Instead, they would remain flexible, moving quickly across the battlefield, striking from unexpected directions and disappearing before the enemy could react. It was a bold departure from conventional thinking, one that prioritized agility over protection. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Germany was doubling down on a very different philosophy. As the war progressed, German engineers began producing increasingly powerful tanks designed to dominate any opponent they faced. Among them were the Tiger I and later the Panther tank. These machines were engineering marvels for their time. The Tiger I, with its thick armor and devastating 88mm gun, could destroy enemy tanks at long range before they even had a chance to respond. The Panther combined sloped armor with high-velocity firepower, making it both deadly and difficult to penetrate. On paper, these German tanks seemed nearly unstoppable. They were heavily armored, heavily armed, and designed to win head-on engagements. But they came with trade-offs. They were expensive to produce, mechanically complex, and often unreliable in prolonged operations. More importantly, their weight limited their mobility. Bridges collapsed under them, engines strained, and maneuverability suffered in tight or muddy terrain. American observers took note of these weaknesses. Instead of trying to match German tanks blow for blow, they chose a different path. They asked a simple but profound question. What if you didn't need to be harder to kill, if you could simply be harder to hit? This question became the foundation of a new approach to armored warfare. Mobility would replace armor as the primary form of protection. A fast vehicle, able to reposition quickly, could avoid enemy fire altogether. Instead of absorbing hits, it would evade them. Instead of engaging in prolonged duels, it would strike quickly and withdraw. Ambush tactics became central to this doctrine. Tank destroyer units would use terrain to their advantage, hiding behind ridge lines, forests, or urban cover. They would wait for enemy armor to advance, expose its flanks, and then attack with precision.
The goal was not just to destroy enemy tanks, but to disrupt their formations, create confusion, and break their momentum. Aggressive maneuver warfare was equally important. Tank destroyers were trained to think independently, to act quickly, and to exploit opportunities as they arose. Commanders were given the flexibility to adapt to rapidly changing situations. Speed was not just a physical characteristic, it was a mindset. Under this approach, a new kind of vehicle was needed. It needed to be fast, faster than anything else on the battlefield. It needed to have enough firepower to destroy heavily armored targets, and it needed to be light enough to move quickly across varied terrain. Protection would be sacrificed, but in return, the vehicle would gain something far more valuable: initiative. The stage was set for the creation of a machine unlike anything that had come before, a vehicle that would embody this radical doctrine, a vehicle designed not to endure the battlefield, but to dominate it through speed, surprise, and precision. In a war where most nations were building heavier and more powerful tanks, the United States was about to take a completely different direction, and in doing so, it would challenge everything that had been assumed about armored warfare. The question was no longer who had the thickest armor or the biggest gun. The question was who could think faster, move faster, and strike first.
By 1942, the idea of a fast, highly mobile tank destroyer was no longer just theory, it was a requirement. The U.S. Army needed a machine that could turn doctrine into reality. It had to be faster than any tank on the battlefield, powerful enough to destroy heavily armored enemies, and light enough to move with unmatched agility. This was not an easy balance to achieve. Every advantage would come with a cost. The responsibility for building this revolutionary vehicle fell to Buick, a company better known for producing civilian automobiles than armored fighting vehicles. Yet this was exactly why they were chosen. Buick's engineers understood speed, engines, and mass production. They approached the problem differently from traditional military designers, focusing on performance and efficiency rather than brute strength. From the very beginning, the design philosophy was clear. Weight had to be minimized. Every extra ton would slow the vehicle down, reducing its greatest advantage. This meant making difficult choices. Armor, the very thing that defined most tanks, would be sacrificed. The new vehicle would not be built to withstand heavy hits. Instead, it would rely on speed to survive. This decision was controversial. Many military leaders were uneasy about sending crews into battle in a vehicle with relatively thin armor. A direct hit from a German tank or anti-tank gun could be devastating. But supporters of the tank destroyer doctrine argued that if the vehicle was used correctly, it should never be in a position to take such a hit in the first place. To achieve the required speed, engineers equipped it with a powerful radial engine, an unusual choice for a ground vehicle, as it was originally designed for aircraft. This engine produced an impressive amount of horsepower, allowing the tank destroyer to accelerate quickly and maintain high speeds across rough terrain. Combined with a lightweight chassis, the result was extraordinary. The vehicle could reach speeds of up to 55 miles per hour, making it the fastest tracked armored vehicle of the entire war. But speed alone was not enough. The vehicle also needed to be stable and controllable at high velocity. Engineers developed an advanced suspension system that allowed it to move smoothly over uneven ground, reducing strain on both the machine and its crew. Wide tracks helped distribute weight and improved mobility in mud, snow, and soft terrain, conditions that often slowed or immobilized heavier tanks. The design also emphasized visibility and awareness. Unlike many tanks of the era, this new machine featured an open-topped turret. This reduced weight and allowed the crew to see and hear the battlefield more clearly. In fast-moving engagements, this awareness could mean the difference between life and death. Crews could spot threats sooner, react faster, and coordinate more effectively. However, this advantage came with significant risks.
The open turret left the crew exposed to artillery fragments, small arms fire, and even the elements. Rain, snow, and extreme temperatures became part of daily life. There was no overhead protection, only speed and skill stood between the crew and danger. At the heart of the vehicle was its main weapon, a 76mm gun capable of penetrating the armor of most German tanks when used correctly. While it could not always match the raw power of heavier German guns, it was accurate, reliable, and deadly when aimed at weak points, such as the sides or rear of enemy vehicles. This reinforced the doctrine of ambush and maneuver. The goal was not to engage in a frontal duel, but to strike where the enemy was most vulnerable. Inside the vehicle, conditions were tight and demanding. The crew had to operate with precision and coordination, often under intense pressure. The driver and assistant driver managed the vehicle's movement, while the gunner, loader, and commander worked together to identify targets and engage quickly. Communication and teamwork were essential. In a machine built for speed, hesitation could be fatal. Despite its unconventional design, the new tank destroyer quickly proved itself during testing. It exceeded expectations in mobility, handling, and overall performance. It could outpace nearly every other armored vehicle on the battlefield, reposition rapidly, and exploit gaps in enemy lines. It was not just fast, it was transformative. This machine would come to be known as the M18 Hellcat. Its name reflected its nature: fast, aggressive, and lethal. It was a hunter, not a brawler, a predator designed to strike swiftly and disappear before the enemy could respond. For the crews who would operate it, the Hellcat demanded a different kind of courage. They could not rely on thick armor to protect them. They had to trust in their training, their instincts, and the speed of their machine. Every engagement required careful positioning, quick thinking, and precise execution. As production ramped up and units began to receive the Hellcat, anticipation grew. Would this radical design succeed where traditional tanks might fail? Could speed really overcome armor in the chaos of real combat? The answers would soon come, not in controlled tests or training grounds, but in the battlefields of Europe, where fog, fear, and enemy fire would put every assumption to the ultimate test.
By the fall of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a new and dangerous phase. Allied forces had broken out from Normandy and were advancing rapidly across France, but the German army was far from defeated. In fact, it was preparing to strike back. In the Lorraine region of eastern France, near a cluster of small towns and rolling farmland, German commanders saw an opportunity to launch a powerful counteroffensive. Their goal was clear: halt the Allied advance and regain the initiative. This is where the M18 Hellcat would face its first true test in large-scale combat. The American forces in the area included the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the new Hellcats. Many of the crews were young, relatively inexperienced, and about to face one of the most dangerous threats on the battlefield: German armored units equipped with some of the most formidable tanks of the war. The coming battle would take place near the town of Arracourt during what would later be known as the Battle of Arracourt. But at the time, no one knew just how significant this clash would become. In late September, thick fog settled over the region, covering the fields and villages in a dense, almost impenetrable mist. Visibility dropped to just a few dozen meters in some areas. For most armies, these conditions would have been a nightmare, but for the Hellcat crews, it created a unique opportunity. German forces began their advance under the cover of fog, believing it would conceal their movements. Columns of tanks, including Panthers and other armored vehicles, pushed forward, expecting to catch the Americans off guard. On paper, the Germans had the advantage: heavier armor, more powerful guns, and experienced crews. But the battlefield was about to prove that those advantages were not absolute. The Hellcat crews, trained in mobility and ambush tactics, adapted quickly to the conditions.
Instead of forming rigid defensive lines, they spread out, using the terrain to their advantage. They positioned themselves behind ridges, along tree lines, and near narrow roads where German tanks would be forced to pass. Then they waited. As German tanks moved through the fog, their visibility was just as limited. Commanders struggled to maintain formation. Units became separated. Communication broke down. What was supposed to be a coordinated assault began to fragment. This was exactly the kind of situation the tank destroyer doctrine had been designed for. When the first German tanks emerged from the mist, the Hellcats struck. Fast, precise, and unexpected. They fired from concealed positions, aiming for the flanks and rear where enemy armor was weakest. Then, almost immediately, they moved, relocating before the Germans could respond. This pattern repeated again and again. Fire, move, disappear. German crews, accustomed to engaging slower, more heavily armored opponents, found themselves facing something entirely different. The Hellcats were difficult to detect, even harder to target, and nearly impossible to pin down. By the time a German tank turned its turret to engage, the Hellcat that fired the shot was already gone. Speed became a weapon in itself. In engagement after engagement, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion used this hit-and-run approach to devastating effect. They exploited the confusion caused by the fog, the terrain, and the German advance itself. Instead of meeting strength with strength, they attacked weakness with precision. There were moments of extreme danger. Hellcat crews knew that a single well-placed shot from a German tank could destroy them. Their armor offered little protection. Every engagement was a calculated risk. But their training, coordination, and mobility allowed them to survive, and more importantly, to win. As the battle continued over several days, the results became increasingly clear. German forces were losing tanks at an alarming rate. Their advance slowed, then stalled, and eventually began to collapse. What had been intended as a powerful counterattack turned into a costly failure. The numbers told a remarkable story. American forces, including the Hellcat-equipped units, destroyed a significant number of German armored vehicles while sustaining relatively low losses in return. It was not just a tactical success, it was a validation of an entirely new way of fighting. The Battle of Arracourt demonstrated that speed, flexibility, and intelligent positioning could overcome even the most heavily armored opponents. It showed that a lighter, faster vehicle, when used correctly, could dominate the battlefield against more powerful enemies. For the crews of the Hellcat, the battle was a turning point. They had proven that their machine and the doctrine behind it worked in real combat. They were no longer an experiment. They were a force to be reckoned with. For the German commanders, it was a warning. The battlefield was changing once again, and the rules they had relied on were no longer guaranteed to bring victory. Out of the fog of Arracourt emerged a new reality. Armor alone was not enough. In the chaos of war, the ability to see first, move first, and strike first could decide everything. By December 1944, the war in Europe took a sudden and violent turn. In a last desperate attempt to regain control of the Western Front, Germany launched a massive surprise offensive through the dense forests of the Ardennes. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, a battle defined by freezing temperatures, limited visibility, and relentless pressure on Allied forces. At the center of this storm stood the town of Bastogne, a critical crossroads that both sides knew could determine the outcome of the campaign. American forces rushed to hold it, despite being outnumbered and underprepared for the brutal winter conditions. Among them was the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the fast but lightly armored Hellcats. This was not the kind of battlefield the M18 Hellcat had been designed for. Gone were the wide-open fields and fluid maneuver warfare of earlier engagements. In Bastogne, the fight was tight, chaotic, and defensive. Roads were narrow, visibility was poor, and German forces attacked from multiple directions. Snow covered the ground, engines struggled in the cold, and supplies were scarce. There was little room to maneuver, and even less room to escape. For the Hellcat crews, the situation was as dangerous as it could get. German forces, including infantry and armored units, pressed hard against the American lines. Artillery shells exploded in the frozen forests, and the constant threat of enemy tanks loomed over every position. The advantage of speed was still there, but using it required precision, timing, and nerve. Instead of long-range ambushes, Hellcat crews were now forced into close engagements. They used whatever cover they could find: buildings, tree lines, slight rises in the terrain to hide their positions. When German tanks advanced, the Hellcats would strike quickly, often at dangerously short distances, aiming for side armor or tracks to disable their opponents. Then, just as quickly, they would reposition. Even in the confined and chaotic environment of Bastogne, mobility remained their greatest strength. While heavier German tanks struggled to navigate narrow roads and deep snow, the lighter Hellcats could shift positions more easily. They moved between defensive points, reinforced weak spots, and responded rapidly to breakthroughs. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion became a critical part of the town's defense, plugging gaps in the line and disrupting German assaults before they could gain momentum. But survival came at a cost. The open-top design of the Hellcat, which had provided excellent visibility in earlier battles, now exposed crews to the harsh winter and constant danger. Snow and ice accumulated inside the vehicle. Artillery fragments and small arms fire posed a constant threat from above. Crews endured freezing temperatures for hours, sometimes days, with little relief. Fatigue, cold, and fear became constant companions. Yet, despite these conditions, acts of extraordinary courage emerged. One such example was Arthur O. Beyer. During the fighting near Bastogne, Beyer repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire while directing and supporting anti-tank operations. His actions helped stop advancing German forces at critical moments, demonstrating the kind of determination that defined the defense of the town. Stories like his were not isolated. Across Bastogne, soldiers and tank destroyer crews fought with a level of resilience that defied the odds. They held their ground, not because conditions favored them, but because retreat was not an option. German commanders expected a quick victory. They believed the surprise attack, combined with superior numbers and heavy armor, would break the American lines. But Bastogne did not fall. The defenders adapted, improvised, and resisted with everything they had. The Hellcat crews played a critical part of that resistance. Even in a battle where their advantages were reduced, they found ways to make their speed and flexibility count. They struck where they could, moved when they had to, and refused to be pinned down. As days passed, the German offensive began to lose momentum. Supply lines stretched thin, resistance stiffened, and Allied reinforcements slowly closed in. The siege of Bastogne, once seen as a potential breakthrough for Germany, turned into a costly stalemate. When the weather finally cleared, Allied air power returned, and the balance shifted. The German advance was halted and then pushed back. For the M18 Hellcat and its crews, Bastogne proved something crucial. Even in the harshest conditions, against overwhelming pressure, the principles of speed, adaptability, and aggressive response could still make the difference between defeat and survival. The battle was not just a defensive stand, it was a testament to endurance, a moment where machines, doctrine, and human determination were pushed to their limits. And when it was over, one thing was certain: the war was entering its final phase, and the Hellcat still had a role to play. As the war in Europe moved into its final months in early 1945, the balance had decisively shifted. German forces were retreating on all fronts, their once powerful armored units weakened by constant losses, fuel shortages, and relentless Allied pressure. Yet even in retreat, they remained dangerous. Scattered pockets of resistance, counterattacks, and desperate defensive actions ensured that the fighting was far from over. For the crews of the M18 Hellcat, this final phase of the war brought a different kind of challenge. The large, sweeping, armored battles of earlier campaigns became less frequent. Instead, they encountered fragmented engagements, ambushes, rear guard actions, and sudden clashes with isolated enemy units. The battlefield was no longer defined by clear front lines, but by unpredictability. In these conditions, the Hellcat's strengths remained highly relevant. Its speed allowed it to exploit breakthroughs as Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory. When resistance was encountered, Hellcat units could quickly maneuver into position, outflank defensive strongpoints, and eliminate threats before they could organize. Their ability to respond rapidly made them invaluable in maintaining momentum during the advance. At the same time, the war revealed the limitations of even the most powerful German tanks. Vehicles like the Tiger I and Panther tank, once feared across Europe, were increasingly outmatched, not always in direct firepower, but in sustainability. Mechanical breakdowns, lack of spare parts, and fuel shortages left many of these machines abandoned or destroyed by their own crews. The contrast was striking. On one side, heavily armored tanks designed for dominance in direct combat. On the other, fast, flexible machines like the Hellcat, built for adaptability and efficiency. The war was proving that victory did not belong solely to the strongest weapon, but to the one that could be used most effectively under real conditions. Beyond Europe, the Hellcat also saw service in the Pacific theater, where the nature of combat was entirely different. Dense jungles, rugged terrain, and limited infrastructure created an environment where heavy armor was often impractical. Here, mobility once again became a decisive advantage. Although Japanese armored forces were generally less formidable than their German counterparts, the challenges of the terrain required the same qualities the Hellcat had been designed for: speed, flexibility, and the ability to operate in difficult conditions. Whether supporting infantry, engaging fortified positions, or responding to sudden threats, the Hellcat adapted to yet another battlefield. As the war drew to a close, the performance of the M18 Hellcat began to be fully understood. It had achieved one of the highest kill-to-loss ratios of any American armored fighting vehicle. It had proven that a lightly armored machine, when used with the right tactics, could defeat more heavily protected opponents. But perhaps its greatest impact was not measured in numbers alone. The Hellcat challenged long-standing assumptions about armored warfare. It demonstrated that speed could serve as a form of protection, that initiative and positioning could outweigh raw strength, that the ability to choose when and where to fight could be more important than the ability to endure punishment. The doctrine that shaped the Hellcat, developed under leaders like Andrew Bruce, left a lasting influence on military thinking. While the dedicated tank destroyer concept would evolve and eventually fade after the war, many of its core ideas lived on. Modern armored forces continue to value mobility, rapid response, and combined arms coordination, principles that were proven in battles fought decades earlier. For the men who served in these vehicles, the legacy was far more personal. They had operated on the edge of vulnerability, relying not on armor, but on speed, awareness, and trust in one another. Every engagement demanded quick decisions and precise execution. There was little margin for error and even less room for hesitation. From the factories in Michigan to the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, the Hellcat carved out a reputation as a machine that defied expectations. It was not the most heavily armed, nor the most heavily armored, but it was one of the most effective. In the end, the story of the Hellcat is not just about a vehicle, it's about an idea, a belief that warfare is not only about power, but how that power is used, a reminder that innovation often comes from challenging what seems obvious. As the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the lessons of the Hellcat remained. Quiet, fast, and deadly, it had changed the rules of the battlefield. And in doing so, it secured its place in history.